3.1, solving two-step equations. Let's talk about a little background information that you'll need to know in order to solve two-step equations. First of all, step 1 is to use the inverse operation. The inverse operation is the opposite operation. For example, the inverse operations of addition is subtraction and vice versa. This first step is to clear the constant. Let's talk about what the constant is. If you have this problem, the constant, I actually rewrite it so that they're different numbers, the constant is actually the 4, okay? You always look at the side with the variable. Here's the variable. And then from there you clear the constant, okay? So this is adding 4, it's a positive 4, so we subtract. Okay? Or as we call it now, we add the opposite. Okay? From now on, we're calling this adding the opposite. Don't even say subtracting. Step 2, we use the inverse operation to clear the coefficient. The coefficient is 3. It's the number that's being multiplied or divided by the variable. The goal in solving equalities is to get the variable on one side and the constants on the other side of the equation. So you end up with an answer sort of like that. You have an x on the left side or right side, it's all by itself, and a number on the other side. Let's try one. 4x plus 9 equals negative 7. First of all, here's the problem. Here's the variable. We need to know where the variable is because this is the side that we need to clear. This is adding 9. This is the constant. Remember that. Constant. So we clear that first. How do you undo positive 9? By adding the opposite, which is negative 9. And we do that to both sides. Okay, remember, we always want to balance our equation. Now what that does is 9 plus negative 9 is 0. Negative 7 plus negative 9 is negative 16. And the 4x just comes down. Now we need to clear the 4. Remember, the goal is to get x by itself. To clear 4, there's this invisible multiplication. The inverse of multiplication is division. And remember, we divide by the number. There's no opposites here. By that number 4, by that coefficient. Okay, remember this is the coefficient. Divide both sides by 4. That becomes 1, which is just x, 1x. Negative 16 divided by 4 is negative 4. Remember, that's what we're looking for, what the x is, and that's negative 4. The solution is negative 4. You can always check your solution by plugging it back in for the x. Well, negative 4 times 4 is negative 16. Add 9, is that negative 7? Yes, it is. So the solution checks. Go ahead and try these problems. Remember to clear the side with the variable, and you want to clear the constant first and then clear the coefficient. And remember, always balance the equations. Do the same thing on both sides. Pause the video at this time. For number 1, this is adding positive 8, so we add the opposite, which is negative 8. And we do that same thing to both sides. 8 plus negative 8 is just 0, so that cancels. And on this side, it's 18. And again, sometimes I just like to bring down that line to show the different sides. Bring down 3x. Here's the x. I have to clear the 3. This is multiplication, so the inverse is dividing by 3. You're left with x on the left, and on the right, 18 minus divided by 3 is 6. Number 2. This time the variable is on the right side. Here's your constant, coefficient, excuse me. This is your constant. Remember, the constant's the first thing I want to solve. or eliminate from that right side, and the coefficient is the second step. How do I get rid of adding a 7, which is positive 7? We add the opposite, which is negative 7. Negative 21 plus negative 7 is negative 28. Equal sign, just keep bringing that down. Bring down 4x, and you don't need this 7 anymore. Got to get rid of the 4 that's being multiplied, so I divide by 4. Negative 28 divided by 4 is negative 7. So x equals negative 7. And you should have the x equals. This time, let's look at what's happening to the variable. The variable right now has subtraction. You're subtracting 4, okay? And I'm actually going to change that. So erase that for a second. Instead of subtracting 4, I'm going to change it to adding the opposite. So let's do that right away. So now what I'm doing is I'm adding negative 4. And I'm dividing by 3. So how do we undo those? Well, by adding positive 4 and by multiplying by 3. So let's do the adding by positive 4 first. Change all those subtractions to the add and the opposite. So now I have negative 4 plus 4, which cancels out. Make sure you balance the equation and add 4 to the right side as well. Negative 1 plus 4 is 3. Here we are dividing by 3, so we can multiply by 3 on both sides. These cancel each other out. Remember, this is technically looks like this, and that means that's 3x over 3. The 3's cancel out, and you just get left with an x. 3 times 3 is 9. The solution is 9. Remember, you can always go back up and check your work. Put the 9 in. 9 divided by 3 is 3 minus 4. Yep, it's negative 1. It checks. Checking your work is a great way to make sure that you're getting the right answer and hopefully getting hundreds on your test because you're checking it. Take the time to do that. Okay, remember that it might be helpful for you to decide what operations are being performed to the variable. Okay, and then figuring out how to undo those operations. So right now, let's change subtractions to adding the opposite. I'm going to do it on both problems. Right now, it's being adding negative 7 to the variable, and we are dividing by 4. So think about how to undo that. Go ahead and pause the video and solve the equation. With number 3, the first thing we need to do is add positive 7 to both sides of the equation, on the left side and the right side. This makes 0, cancels, and this is 9. Bring down x divided by 4. And then to get rid of dividing by 4, we multiply by 4. That would cancel, you're left with x. And now we have 9 times 4, which is 36. So x equals 36. Did you check your work to determine if it's right? Make sure you do that. Number 4. What's happening to the variable? Well, there is adding negative 3 and dividing 5. So how do I undo that? Subtracting, which we don't call subtraction anymore. We actually call it adding the opposite. So we add, what's the opposite? Positive 3, and multiply by 5. Remember, 3 is the constant, so that's what we move first. You have 11 equals b divided by 5. Multiply by 5 to cancel the 5's. Multiply by 5 on the left side as well. You have 55 equals b. Again, there's no need to move the variable and rewrite the problem. just make sure you're clearing everything that's on the same side as the variable, and it doesn't matter where you start, if the variable's on the left or the right. And remember, you can always check to see if this makes sense. And you can see it does. It checks. Let's talk about negative coefficients. You can see this is 2 minus 3x, and we change that to adding the opposite. Okay, I'm going to come down here and I'm going to write out my little chart that I've been doing. One side is what's happening, the second side is how to undo it. So let's look at our equation. You have 2. That's the constant, right? There's no variable next to it, and it's being added to x. So adding 2, and then we have multiplication, and it's negative 3. So how do I undo that? Well, I add the opposite of positive 2, which is negative 2, and then the opposite operation or inverse operation of division, and that is dividing by negative 3. Okay, I'm not exactly thrilled how they set this up, so I'm going to just rewrite it for you on the side here. I add the negative 2 to both sides. You're left with negative 3x and 15. Again, if you want to just write it in, you can. Now I divide by the negative, okay, because you always divide by that coefficient to both sides. Those cross out, you're left with x, and 15 divided by negative 3 is negative 5. The solution is negative 5. Check it, put it back in. Let's add this opposite. This is positive 15 plus 2, which equals 17. It checks. Solve the equation. You might want to set up your chart first. Think about what's going on, how to undo it. Add those opposites. Always do that first. Add the opposites first. So we are adding positive 3 to the variable, and we are multiplying by negative 2. So think about how to undo that. Go ahead and pause the video. Remember, you may want to set up your chart on this number 6 as well. For number 5, we have to add negative 3, because that's the constant. We do that to both sides. Oops, that's a positive. Remember to always check your signs. And then we divide by negative 2. Divide by negative 2. Y equals negative 8. Remember, you can always go back and check to make sure you're right. For number 6, let's add the negative. Oh, there's no number there. What is the invisible number next to m? You should have said 1, which means that I am adding, well, here's the constant, so I'm adding positive 4, I am multiplying negative 1. How do you undo that? Add negative 4 and divide negative 1. So add negative 4, negative 9 equals, those 4's cancel out, negative 1m. I always like to put the 1 there just so I see that number, and I divide by negative 1. You should get m equals positive 9. And again, check to see if that makes sense. And you can see that is negative 5. That checks.